On their honeymoon, he whispered something that left her breathless. "I won't cross the line," he said. But her response was so unexpected, it completely disarmed him. And in that moment, everything changed between them. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what happened next will surprise you. The scent of magnolia blossoms perfumed the suite, when Willa answered with a voice that trembled between innocence and courage. "What if I wanted you to cross them?" The words resonated in the luxurious silence of the Charleston night, and Sterling, the man who commanded financial empires with an iron fist, felt for the first time in 42 years that he had no control whatsoever. The coastal breeze drifted through the balcony, bringing with it the aroma of salt marsh and jasmine. Between sheets of Egyptian cotton and the glow of beeswax candles, a story began that would transform two lives in ways neither could imagine. Sometimes destiny doesn't announce its arrival with drums. Sometimes it whispers, and only those willing to listen with their hearts can hear its call. Willa had just turned 23 when she accepted the whirlwind marriage proposal from this man she'd met barely 6 weeks earlier in a traditional bookstore cafe in Savannah's historic district. Raised in a Georgia family of old lineage, where values inherited from generations still dictated every gesture and every choice, the young woman carried within her a purity that wasn't naivety, but a conscious choice to preserve something precious in a world that seemed to have lost the notion of true intimacy. Her hazel eyes reflected an ancestral wisdom, inherited from grandmothers, who told her stories to the sound of old folk songs, while the smell of pecan pie and sweet tea perfumed Sunday afternoons. She possessed a natural delicacy that manifested in every movement, from the way she held a teacup to the gentle manner in which she pronounced words with that melodious southern accent. But behind that apparent fragility dwelt a silent strength, forged in years watching her mother quilt while transforming adversities into opportunities. Sterling, on the other hand, had built his empire from nothing, fighting against a past of deprivation in the hardscrabble lands of rural Kentucky that marked every decision he made. At 17, he had left the town where he was born, with barely a worn duffel bag and the determination never again to feel the grip of need. 30 years later, his name appeared in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes. His companies moved millions of dollars, and his loneliness was proportional to the size of his conquests. When he met Willa in that bookstore cafe, where she worked part-time while studying literature at the College of Charleston, something inexplicable happened. The way she recited verses from Whitman and Dickinson while preparing coffee, the manner in which her delicate fingers traced invisible words in the air when explaining the metaphors of frost, the genuine smile she offered each customer as if it were a unique gift. All of it penetrated his defenses like water seeping into porous stone. Now in this suite overlooking Charleston Harbor, where genteel southern charm met coastal elegance, Sterling looked at the woman who had just become his wife and felt that all the walls he'd erected during decades were crumbling with a single phrase. It wasn't just desire he saw in her eyes, it was an invitation to be vulnerable, to release control, to allow himself to be human. But somewhere in New York, at that precise instant, a phone was ringing insistently in an empty office. And when it would finally be answered in a few hours, everything would change. The first 2 days in Charleston unfolded like a dream woven with golden threads. They walked through the cobblestone streets of the historic district, Willa stopping to touch the Confederate jasmine that spilled from wrought-iron balconies, Sterling observing each expression of enchantment that crossed her face. They tasted she-crab soup, dipped cornbread into pot liquor that shimmered like liquid gold, savored Benny wafers still warm from the oven. She closed her eyes with each taste, savoring not just with her mouth, but with all her senses. He found himself watching her with an intensity he'd never dedicated to any business deal. For the first time in his life, Sterling wasn't planning the next move, wasn't calculating risks, wasn't building strategies. He was simply being. "You know what I love about you?" Willa asked that afternoon as they walked along the Battery Promenade. The November sun painted the live oak leaves in shades of gold and amber. "When you look at me, you really see me. Not the idea of me, not what I represent, but me." Sterling stopped in his tracks. No one had ever said something like that to him. In the business world, people saw his money, his power, his influence. Even the women who had passed through his life had seen the symbol, never the man. "Sometimes I'm afraid," he confessed, the words emerging before he could stop them, "that one day you'll wake up and discover I'm not what you hoped for." Willa took his face between her delicate hands, those same hands he'd seen serve coffee with such grace. "Sterling, I didn't marry your companies. I married the man who told me about the tobacco fields of his childhood, who admitted having nightmares about going hungry again, who cried when I told him about my grandfather. That's the man I want." But that same night, when they returned to the suite after dining at a small restaurant where the owner treated them like old friends, Sterling's cell phone began to vibrate. It was 3 in the morning. He ignored the first call, and the second. But when the third began, he knew something was wrong. "I have to take this," he murmured, kissing Willa's forehead as she slept peacefully. The voice on the other end of the line was his principal partner, Thaddeus, and it sounded broken. "Sterling, I'm sorry. I've been trying to reach you for hours. It's catastrophic." During the next 20 minutes, while the full moon bathed Charleston Harbor in silver light, Sterling's world collapsed. A carefully orchestrated strike by New York competitors had drained millions in a matter of days. Phantom investments, falsified documents, betrayals by people he'd trusted. Everything he'd fought for during 30 years was evaporating like morning mist over the Ashley River. "How much is left?" he asked in a hollow voice. "Practically nothing. The properties are mortgaged to the ceiling, the accounts frozen. The lawyers say we can salvage something if we act fast, but Sterling, we need you back now." He hung up the phone and stood staring at the dark Atlantic that stretched beyond the balcony. The man who had built an empire from Kentucky dust no longer existed. In his place stood a husband of 3 days on his honeymoon, about to tell his wife that everything had been an illusion. He watched Willa sleep, her dark hair scattered across the embroidered white pillow, her gentle breathing making the sheets rise and fall. And a question shot through his mind like lightning. Would she stay with him when she discovered he was no longer the millionaire she'd fallen in love with? Fear paralyzed him. That same fear he'd converted into fuel for decades, that had driven him never to stop, never to trust completely, never to be vulnerable. And now he was married to the only person who had made him lower all his defenses. When Willa opened her eyes at dawn, she found him sitting on the balcony, still dressed in last night's clothes, staring at the horizon with a devastated expression. "What happened?" she asked, with that instinct some women have for perceiving when the world has shifted on its axis. And Sterling, the man who had never cried in public, who had built a reputation for being inflexible as steel, felt tears rolling down his cheeks. Willa approached barefoot, her white nightgown rippling with the morning breeze that carried the scent of salt and pluff mud. She knelt before Sterling, taking his hands in hers, waiting. She didn't demand explanations, didn't show panic. She simply waited, with that ancient patience she'd inherited from women who knew that important truths need their own time to emerge. "I lost everything," he finally murmured, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. "During the night. While you were sleeping. While we were happy. Everything went to hell." He told her everything. The numbers, the betrayals, the falsified documents, the emptied accounts. Each word was like tearing away a piece of his pride, exposing the vulnerability he'd spent a lifetime hiding. He expected to see disappointment in her eyes, perhaps horror, maybe regret for marrying him so quickly. What he saw completely disarmed him. Willa stood up, walked to the small kitchen in the suite, and began preparing strong coffee in a French press. The domestic sounds, water boiling, spoon against porcelain, created a symphony of normalcy that contrasted brutally with the chaos in Sterling's mind. She returned with 2 steaming mugs and sat facing him. "Then it's time to discover who we really are when everything else disappears," she said with a firmness he'd never seen in her. "Willa, you don't understand. I have nothing. The houses, the cars, everything is mortgaged or will be seized. I may have to declare bankruptcy. Your family? What will they think?" "My family," she responded with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes but somewhere deeper, "survived the depression by hiding family treasures in the walls of our store. My grandmother sold gold jewelry 1 piece at a time to buy food on the black market. My grandfather worked as a carpenter despite having been a teacher, because his degree meant nothing after the crash. Do you really think they'll judge me for staying with my husband when things get difficult?" She sipped her coffee slowly. letting the words settle between them. "The question, Sterling, isn't what they'll think. The question is, do you trust me enough to let me stand beside you in this?" He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. This woman he'd met in a bookstore cafe, who recited poetry while serving scones, who seemed as delicate as a magnolia blossom, had a core of steel forged in generations of survival and resistance. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," he admitted. "Then we'll be strong together," she replied. "But I need you to promise me something. No secrets. No trying to protect me by hiding the truth. If we're going to face this, we face it with complete honesty." Sterling nodded, unable to speak. He extended his hand and she took it, intertwining their fingers. And in that moment, as the sun rose over the South Carolina coast, illuminating the harbor with shades of gold and silver, both felt that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. They were no longer the millionaire and the young idealist. They were two people facing a storm, and the only way to survive was to hold on to each other. They packed that same morning. The rest of the honeymoon was cancelled. The flight back to Savannah was full of businessmen talking loudly on their phones, weary tourists with crying children, the constant hum of engines. Willa kept her hand intertwined with Sterling's throughout the journey, sometimes squeezing when she felt him tense while reading the messages that kept arriving on his phone. Each message was worse than the last. Partners distancing themselves, employees asking about their salaries, creditors demanding immediate meetings. The empire he'd built brick by brick was crumbling at the speed of a house of cards in a hurricane. When they landed in Savannah, reality hit them with the force of a freight train. There was no longer a driver waiting. Sterling called a cab, something he hadn't done in years. Willa observed how his jaw tensed with each small humiliation, each reminder of what he'd lost. "My apartment on Jones Street," she indicated to the taxi driver. "It's small, but it overlooks the square." "We have to go to my office in New York first," Sterling protested. "There are meetings, lawyers, I need to—" "What you need," she interrupted gently but firmly, "is a safe place where you can think clearly. New York can wait until tomorrow. Tonight you're coming home." Willa's apartment was on the third floor of a pre-Civil War building, with walls so thick they kept the cool even during Savannah's sweltering summers. Sterling climbed the stairs behind her, carrying the suitcases that a week before a five-star hotel porter had handled. When she opened the door, he stopped on the threshold. The space was tiny compared to his New York penthouse, a living room that served as dining room and kitchen, a bedroom barely larger than the bed, a bathroom with antique fixtures. But there was something about this place that tightened his chest with an emotion he couldn't name. The walls were covered with bookshelves full of books, Faulkner, O'Connor, Morrison, worn editions with notes in the margins. A well-loved sofa facing a window that overlooked Forsyth Park, where Spanish moss draped from ancient oaks, plants in terracotta pots, a banjo leaning in a corner, family photographs in simple frames. "This is all I have," Willa said, suddenly shy. "Compared to your houses—" "It's perfect," he interrupted, and he meant it. In this modest space, there was more life, more warmth, more authenticity than in all the properties he'd owned. "It's a real home." That night they ate chicken and dumplings that Willa prepared with ingredients she had in the refrigerator, accompanied by day-old cornbread warmed in the oven. Sterling couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten something so simple and paradoxically so satisfying. "My grandmother is coming tomorrow," she mentioned, as they washed dishes together in the small sink. "She wants to meet you. Well, she already saw you at the wedding, but she wants to talk to you alone." "Should I be worried?" He tried to joke, but the tension was evident in his voice. Willa smiled. "My grandmother is special. She's 90 years old, but has a mind sharper than many 30-year-olds. And she sees things others don't see." That night, lying in the small bed that barely fit in the bedroom, with the sound of nocturnal creatures in Forsyth Park and the distant church bells marking the hours, Sterling allowed himself to cry. He cried for the lost empire, for the years of effort that seemed to have been in vain, for the fear of not being enough without the money that had defined him for so long. Willa held him, letting the tears soak her nightgown, saying nothing, offering no empty comfort. She was simply there, solid and present, like a lighthouse in the storm. "What am I going to do?" he finally whispered. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I was." "Then you'll learn," she replied, kissing his forehead, "and I'll be here every step of the way." The next day the grandmother arrived. Miss Althea was a diminutive woman, with penetrating eyes the same hazel color as Willa's, hands marked with age spots following a tradition that went back to her Gullah ancestors, and a presence that filled any room. She arrived without warning, climbed the stairs without losing her breath despite her 90 years, and studied Sterling with an intensity that made him feel evaluated down to his soul. "So you're the man who stole my granddaughter's heart," she said without preamble, settling onto the sofa as if it were a throne. "The millionaire." "I'm no longer a millionaire, ma'am," Sterling responded with honesty. Miss Althea clicked her tongue. "Money comes and goes like the tides. What matters is what remains when the tide goes out. Sit down, boy. We need to talk." What followed was a conversation that would change everything. Miss Althea pulled a package wrapped in old cloth from her bag. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a 19th-century ledger book with worn leather covers and yellowed pages filled with elaborate penmanship. "Our family," she began, "hasn't always owned a small antique shop. Generations ago, we were merchants of rice and indigo with connections from Charleston to the Caribbean, free people of color who survived by being shrewd, by keeping secrets, by preserving what mattered." Sterling listened, fascinated. Willa had moved closer, sitting on the sofa's arm near her grandmother, equally absorbed in a story she evidently knew only partially. "When the Depression came," the old woman continued, "my father knew dark times were ahead. He hid our treasures, jewelry, property deeds, gold coins, some in the walls of the shop, others in places only he knew. He died without revealing all the locations, fearful the information would fall into the wrong hands." She opened the ledger book, pointing to entries written in a mixture of English and Gullah. "But he left this, a code I've spent years trying to fully decipher. And I believe," her eyes gleamed with a youthful intensity trapped in an old body, "I finally understand part of it." "Grandmother," Willa intervened gently, "why are you telling us this now?" "Because," Miss Althea looked directly at Sterling, "this man lost his fortune. Very well, fortunes are lost, but he has something more valuable. He has you, and he has an opportunity to build something real, not based on paper and promises, but on something tangible. And maybe, just maybe, what my grandfather hid can help you start." Sterling felt the world tilting again. "Ma'am, I can't accept—" "I'm not offering charity," she cut him off. "I'm offering a partnership. You have business experience, knowledge of the modern world. We have hidden resources that need someone with your expertise to convert them into something useful. Besides," her expression softened, "you're family now. And family takes care of each other." During the following hours, Miss Althea explained what she knew. Properties in Savannah's historic district registered under names that no longer existed, contacts with African-American heritage networks in New York and Philadelphia, objects of historical value stored in forgotten basements. It wasn't an immediate fortune, but it was a beginning. "There's one condition," she added, her eyes fixed on Sterling. "You have to learn our trades. My son, Willa's father, restores antique furniture. He needs help. You'll work with him, learn with your hands, not just your head. Can you do that?" Sterling thought about his hands, which had only held phones and signed documents for decades. The idea of working manually seemed both intimidating and liberating. "I can try," he responded. "Trying isn't enough," the old woman replied. "Will you do it?" He looked at Willa, who watched the scene with tears shining in her eyes. "Yes," he said firmly, "I will." But that same afternoon, when Miss Althea left and Sterling finally traveled to New York to face the disaster of his companies, he discovered things were worse than he'd imagined. The lawyers had bad news. There were lawsuits, investigations, the possibility of criminal charges for financial negligence, even though he was the victim of fraud. In the offices that had once been his kingdom, now strangely empty with employees packing their belongings, Sterling faced an impossible decision. He could fight, spend the limited resources he had left on legal battles that could last years, or he could let go, accept the loss, and start over. Willa's voice echoed in his mind. "Then it's time to discover who we really are when everything else disappears." He made his decision. 3 weeks later, Sterling found himself in Willa's family's furniture restoration workshop, located behind the antique shop in Savannah's historic district. The space smelled of old wood, varnish, and turpentine. Tools he couldn't name hung from the walls. His father-in-law, Mr. Barnaby, a 60-year-old man with calloused hands and kind eyes, looked at him with a mixture of compassion and skepticism. "Ever worked with your hands, Mr.?" Barnaby asked without malice, just practical curiosity. "No," Sterling admitted, "but I'm willing to learn." "Willing and able are two different things," the older man replied, handing him a piece of sandpaper. "But we'll start with the basics. See that 18th century secretary? It needs you to remove all the old varnish layer, gently, with patience. Every stroke counts." The first weeks were humbling. Sterling discovered muscles he didn't know existed. His hands, accustomed to the smoothness of Italian suits and computer keyboards, blistered and cracked. He made mistakes that made Mr. Barnaby sigh with infinite patience. He ruined pieces that would have been valuable if he'd been more careful. But something strange began to happen. In the silence of the workshop, with the repetitive rhythm of sanding, planing, polishing, his mind found a peace he'd never experienced in boardrooms. There was no next move to plan, no competitors to outmaneuver, just the wood beneath his hands and the gradual transformation of something old into something beautiful again. "You're starting to understand," Mr. Barnaby commented one afternoon, watching Sterling work on a table that had belonged to a Savannah merchant family. "It's not about dominating the wood, but listening to what it wants to be." Willa came every afternoon after her literature classes, bringing sweet tea and pimento cheese sandwiches. Sometimes she sat in a corner of the workshop, grading student papers while he worked. The silent companionship was more valuable than any conversation, but the nights were different. In the small apartment on Jones Street, after showers that washed away sawdust and varnish, they shared simple dinners and talked about their days. Sterling told her about the pieces he was restoring, and she told him about her students, many from struggling families in tough neighborhoods, who found in literature an escape from harsh realities. "You know what I tell them," she commented one night, as they prepared shrimp and grits together in the small kitchen. "I tell them that words have the power to transform not just stories, but entire lives. That reading Whitman or Dickinson isn't just memorizing verses, it's learning that pain can become beauty, that struggle can have meaning." Sterling was chopping tomatoes with a clumsiness that made her smile. "And do they believe you?" "Some do. Others need to see it to believe it." She paused, looking at him with those hazel eyes that seemed to see directly into his soul. "Like you. You needed to lose everything to discover you could be more than your money." The truth of her words hurt, but it was a necessary pain, like muscles growing stronger after exercise. 2 months after their return from the truncated honeymoon, something extraordinary happened. Mr. Barnaby led Sterling to the back of the workshop, to a basement that rarely opened. There, covered in dust and forgetfulness, were breathtaking pieces. 18th century highboys, federal-style chairs, carved chests with religious scenes and symbols Sterling now recognized as hidden African heritage markers. "These pieces," Mr. Barnaby explained, "have been in our family for generations. Some we saved hidden during hard times, others were inherited from families that disappeared. I never knew what to do with them. Selling them seemed like betrayal. Keeping them hidden seemed like waste." He gently touched a Chippendale desk with ivory and exotic wood inlays. "But you understand both worlds now, that of monetary value and that of historical value, that of the market and that of meaning. What would you do with all this?" Sterling walked among the pieces, his mind, dormant for months through manual labor, suddenly awakening. Not with business fever, but with new clarity. He saw possibilities: careful restoration, professional authentication, connections with museums and ethical collectors. "We could create something special," he murmured, touching the wood with newly learned reverence. "Not just sell, but preserve. Tell the stories behind each piece. Make history accessible not just for the wealthy, but for anyone who values art and memory." Mr. Barnaby smiled for the first time with genuine approval. "Now you're thinking like someone in this family." But not everything was tranquil progress. One March afternoon, when azaleas were beginning to bloom in Savannah, Thaddeus, Sterling's former partner, appeared at the workshop. He wore a $3,000 suit, a Rolex on his wrist, and an offer that would change everything. "The New Yorkers who destroyed us," he said without preamble, sitting on a dusty workbench without caring about his suit, "are in trouble. A fraud investigation. They need to liquidate assets fast. There's an opportunity to recover some of the companies, Sterling, but we need to act now, and we need capital." Sterling cleaned his hands on a rag, aware of how he must look. Stained work clothes, sawdust in his hair, smell of varnish. So different from the man Thaddeus had known. "I don't have capital. But your wife does. Or rather her family." Thaddeus leaned forward. "I've been researching. Those antiques they have, restored and sold properly, could provide significant seed capital. Combined with some investors I've contacted who still trust your name, we could recover at least 30% of what we lost, maybe more." The old Sterling would have jumped at the opportunity without thinking twice, but the man he was becoming hesitated. "Those antiques aren't just assets. They're family history." "They're wood and metal," Thaddeus countered. "Beautiful history, yes, but at the end of the day, they have a monetary value that could change your future. Are you going to sand furniture for the rest of your life? Live in a 500-square-foot apartment? You?" The words hit exactly where Thaddeus intended. Because as much as Sterling was learning to appreciate simplicity, part of him missed the power, the influence, the feeling of making important things happen. That night, he couldn't sleep. Willa, sensing his restlessness, asked what was wrong. He told her everything about Thaddeus's offer, about the possibility of recovering part of his old world. "What do you want to do?" she asked in a neutral voice. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to take that opportunity, prove I can bounce back. But another part," he touched his calloused hands, "feels like I'd be betraying something important. Betraying your family, betraying what I've been learning." Willa sat up in bed, hugging her knees. "My grandmother told me a story once about my great-grandfather, who had an opportunity to make a lot of money selling properties that had been in the family for generations. He could have lived like a king, but he chose not to, because he said some things have a value that can't be measured in money. He died poor in material terms, but rich in his community's respect and in his conscience's peace." She paused, looking at him directly. "I'm not going to tell you what to do, Sterling. This has to be your decision, but I ask you this. Who do you want to be? The man you were or the man you're discovering you can be?" The question kept him awake until dawn. The next day, he met Thaddeus at a cafe near the cathedral. His former partner arrived with expectation gleaming in his eyes, clearly convinced Sterling would accept the offer. "The answer is no," Sterling said without preamble. Thaddeus blinked. "Excuse me? I'm not going to sell my in-laws' antiques to finance revenge against the New Yorkers. I'm not going to rebuild my old empire. That died, and it's fine that it's dead." "You're crazy," Thaddeus said, genuinely perplexed. "Do you know how many men would kill for this opportunity?" "Probably many," Sterling nodded. "But I'm not one of them anymore." He saw disappointment, then contempt cross Thaddeus's face. "That woman changed you. She turned you into someone weak." Sterling smiled, and it was a genuine smile. "No, she helped me become someone real. There's a difference." When Thaddeus left, Sterling sat a while longer, watching the cathedral spire rising against Savannah's blue sky. He felt something in his chest lighten, as if he'd released a weight he'd been carrying for decades without knowing it. He had made the most difficult decision of his life, and paradoxically, he'd never felt so certain about anything. But refusing Thaddeus's offer had consequences Sterling didn't anticipate. A week later, articles began appearing in financial media. "Ex-tycoon Sterling Caldwell refuses redemption opportunity," one said. "From millionaire to carpenter. Defeat or strategy," another speculated. Former contacts stopped answering his calls. People he'd considered friends posted comments on social media suggesting he'd lost his judgment. One particularly painful comment came from a mentor who had helped him in his early years. "It's sad to see someone with so much potential give up in the face of difficulty." What hurt most was that some of those comments echoed his own doubts. Had he made the right decision? Was he noble or simply cowardly, afraid to risk again and lose again? The workshop became his refuge, but even there, doubts pursued him. One afternoon, working on a particularly delicate piece, an 18th century secretary with intricate marquetry, his attention wandered for a second. The tool slipped, tearing a section of veneer that had taken weeks to prepare. "Damn it!" he shouted, throwing the tool against the wall. Barnaby appeared immediately, assessing the damage with a glance. "It's repairable," he said calmly. "I ruined it. Weeks of work, destroyed because I can't concentrate, because I can't stop wondering if I'm an idiot for being here, instead of out there rebuilding what I lost." The words poured out like a torrent. Maybe they're all right. Maybe this isn't noble. It's just escapism. Hiding from the fear of failure by pretending honest work with my hands is enough. Mr. Barnaby sat slowly on his workbench, indicating Sterling should do the same. Let me tell you something about failure, he began. When I was your age, I had an opportunity to expand our business. A foreign investor wanted to finance us to open shops across the South. We would have been wealthy. What happened? I said no, because it would have meant changing how we worked, hiring people who didn't understand the value of what we did, converting art into commodity. My wife was furious with me for a year. My brothers never forgave me. That investor went with a competitor who now has 20 stores across the country. He paused, his eyes distant. For years I wondered if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. But then I look around this workshop, see the pieces we've saved, the stories we've preserved, and I know I made the right decision for me. Not for everyone, not the decision others would have made, but mine. Sterling felt tears stinging his eyes. What if I discover I made the wrong decision? What do I do then? Then you make another decision, Mr. Barnaby replied simply. Life isn't one choice that determines everything. It's 1,000 small choices every day. The question isn't whether this particular decision was right or wrong. The question is, who do you want to be tomorrow? That night in the apartment, Willa found him sitting on the balcony, watching the Spanish moss sway in the breeze. Want to talk? She asked, sitting beside him. I'm afraid, he admitted. Afraid this isn't enough. That I'm not enough without the money, without the power, without everything that made me important. Willa took his calloused hand in hers. Sterling, can I tell you what I see when I look at you now versus what I saw when I met you? He nodded, unable to speak. When you walked into that bookstore cafe months ago, I saw a man who thought he had to buy everything he wanted, even love. You ordered the most expensive thing on the menu not because you liked it, but because you thought price determined value. You left extravagant tips not out of generosity, but because you needed people to know you could afford it. Her words hurt because they were true. But now, she continued, I see a man who chose difficulty over ease, who chose to learn something new when he could have clung to the old, who chose the family he gained through marriage over the fortune he lost through betrayal. And that man, Sterling, that man is infinitely more valuable than the millionaire I met. Even if I never become rich again? Especially if you never become rich again, because then I'll know you chose me, not the idea of me, that you chose this life, not as consolation but as true choice. They sat in silence, listening to the night sounds of Savannah, the distant church bells, the murmur of a city that never completely slept. And in that moment, Sterling began to understand that maybe Mr. Barnaby was right. It wasn't one decision that determined everything, but 1,000 small choices every day. And tomorrow, he could choose again. But before he could find complete peace, a crisis would arrive that would test everything he'd learned. Summer arrived in Savannah with its characteristic heat that turned the streets into ovens at midday. The workshop, despite its thick walls, became stifling. Sterling had learned to work in the early morning hours and at twilight, as craftsmen had done for centuries. It was a July afternoon when Willa arrived at the workshop earlier than usual. Sterling knew immediately something was wrong from the pallor of her face, from how her hands trembled as she closed the door. It's my grandmother, she said without preamble. The doctor says her heart is failing. She has maybe 6 months, perhaps less. Mr. Barnaby dropped the tool he was holding. What? During the next hour, as they closed the workshop early and rushed to the hospital, Sterling observed how Willa's family transformed in the face of crisis. The strength he'd admired, the unity he'd envied, all was there but filtered through raw pain. Miss Althea was in a hospital bed, connected to monitors that beeped with hypnotic regularity. But her eyes were still fierce, her voice weak but firm. I don't want your long faces, she said when everyone entered. I've lived 90 magnificent years. What concerns me isn't my ending, but what I'll leave unresolved. She looked directly at Sterling. The ledger book I showed you, I deciphered more. There's a property, a house in Charleston's Ansonborough neighborhood, registered under a name that no longer exists legally, but it's ours. That's where my grandfather hid the most valuable things before the Depression. Grandmother, don't worry about that now, Willa interrupted, tears rolling down her cheeks. Of course I worry, the old woman replied, with a flash of her usual spirit. I've kept these secrets too long, Sterling. She gripped his hand with surprising strength. I need you to go to Charleston, find that house, recover what's ours before it's too late. Not for the money, but because they're pieces of our history that shouldn't be lost. She gave him detailed instructions, addresses she'd memorized as a child, descriptions of specific marks on old walls. Sterling memorized them all, aware this might be one of the last things she'd ask of him. That night Willa was devastated. I can't lose her, she sobbed in Sterling's arms. Not now. Not when I finally have a complete life to share with her. He held her without empty words of comfort, just solid presence. But inside, his mind was working. There was something in what Miss Althea said, in the urgency of her request, that made him feel this was more than just recovering lost objects. It was a test, perhaps the last one the old woman would give him. The next day, with Willa's blessing, though reluctant to let him go at such a time, Sterling travelled to Charleston. The city received him with stifling heat and the scent of jasmine. The Ansonborough neighbourhood, the old historic district, was a labyrinth of narrow streets that climbed and descended gentle slopes. He followed Miss Althea's instructions, looking for specific marks, counting corners, identifying houses by architectural details that only someone who knew them intimately could remember. Finally, after hours of searching, he found what seemed to be the right place. A small house with whitewashed walls partially in ruins, with a wooden door eaten by termites that barely held on its hinges. The door was locked with a modern padlock, but Sterling noticed a side window was broken. He hesitated only a moment before slipping through. The interior smelled of humidity and years of abandonment. There was evidence someone had been there recently, footprints in the dust, some floorboards lifted and carelessly replaced. He followed Miss Althea's final instructions. Count tiles from the fireplace, look for a specific stone with a mark that looked Arabic but was actually ancient Hebrew. He found it and, with effort, pushed it inward. A compartment opened. Inside was a wooden chest, surprisingly intact. He opened it with trembling hands. Yellowed documents, faded photographs, jewelry that gleamed even after decades in darkness. But more valuable than all that, property certificates for land in what was now Charleston's historic district. Documents proving family lineage, going back to free people of color in the antebellum South. Letters telling stories of survival and resistance. And at the bottom, a sealed envelope with Miss Althea's handwriting, clearly placed there recently, waiting for him. He opened it with trembling hands. Sterling, the letter read, if you're reading this, it means you had the courage to come. These documents prove our family has rights to properties worth millions. You could sell them, recover your lost fortune and more. Or you could use them another way. The choice is yours. But whatever you decide, remember, the real treasure you found isn't in this chest, but in who you've become to deserve it. Your grandmother by marriage, Althea. Sterling sat on the dusty floor of that old house, holding documents that could change his life again, and cried. He cried for the wisdom of an old woman who used her final days to teach him one last lesson. He cried for the impossible choice he faced. He cried for the man he'd been and the man he was struggling to be. When he returned to Savannah the next day, the hospital gave him devastating news. Miss Althea had suffered a heart attack during the night. She was stable, but weak. The doctors didn't know how much time she had left. He entered her room, holding the chest. She opened her eyes upon hearing him, and a small smile crossed her lips. Did you find it? Yes. And? Sterling placed the chest at the foot of her bed. And I decided I first want to ask you something. Why me? Why trust me with this? Miss Althea took a labored breath. Because I saw in you what you didn't yet see, a man capable of changing, a man who loved my granddaughter enough to become someone worthy of her, a man who could value history as much as money. She paused, her eyes penetrating despite her physical weakness. Was I right? Sterling looked at Willa, who had entered silently behind him. He saw in her eyes the unspoken question, hope mixed with fear. Yes, he finally answered. You were right. But making the right decision doesn't mean it's easy to live with. The following days were the darkest Sterling had experienced. Miss Althea worsened day by day, her fighting spirit gradually yielding to the inevitability of biology. Willa spent every free moment at the hospital, and Sterling watched how pain consumed her. The workshop felt empty without the old woman's occasional presence. who used to appear to constructively criticize his work or tell stories about the pieces they were restoring. Mr. Barnaby worked in silence, his sadness manifesting in even more intense concentration on every detail. One night, Sterling couldn't bear it anymore. He left Willa sleeping restlessly at the hospital and walked through Savannah's empty streets to the river. The Savannah River flowed dark and indifferent, as it had for centuries, witness to countless human stories of triumph and tragedy. He sat on a bench and pulled out his phone. He'd been avoiding the news, but now he deliberately searched. He found what he knew he'd find, articles about Thaddeus and other partners who had taken the opportunity he'd refused. They'd recovered some companies, were rebuilding. Photos showed them at events, smiling, successful. In contrast, he was sitting by the river at 2 in the morning in stained work clothes, facing the possible death of his grandmother-in-law, while his wife suffered and he couldn't do anything to ease her pain. "See, this is what you get for choosing noble over practical," he murmured to the darkness. "Talking to yourself, that's never a good sign." Sterling startled. An older man was sitting at the other end of the bench. He hadn't heard him arrive. He had the look of someone who lived on the streets, worn but clean clothes, a bag of belongings at his feet, surprisingly clear eyes. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you," the stranger continued. "I'm Chester. This is my bench, but there's room enough for 2 troubled souls." Sterling should have left, but something in the man's voice stopped him. "Sterling," he replied. "Ah, a strong name. My grandfather was called that. He was a blacksmith." Chester pulled a thermos from his bag. "Coffee?" "It's cold, but it's coffee." Sterling accepted, though he didn't know why. They drank in silence for a moment, listening to the river. "So, what brings you here at this hour?" Chester asked. And to Sterling's surprise, he found himself telling everything. The fall, the marriage, the workshop, the decision to refuse the money, Miss Althea's illness, the doubts gnawing at him. The words poured out, as if they'd been dammed up too long. Chester listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding. When Sterling finished, the old man remained silent for a long moment. "You know what's funny about life?" he finally said. "It's not a straight line from point A to point B. It's more like this river here. Sometimes it flows fast, sometimes slow. Sometimes it curves, turns, seems to go backward, but it always keeps moving toward the sea." "That's very poetic," Sterling responded with more bitterness than he'd intended. "But it doesn't help much when you're stuck in the mud." "Stuck?" Chester laughed softly. "Son, you have a wife who loves you, a family that accepted you, a craft you're learning, a legacy you can build. Me, on the other hand, I lost everything years ago. Family, business, home. One bad decision after another, each one seeming right at the time." He looked at Sterling directly. "But you know the difference between you and me? You chose your path consciously. You evaluated what mattered and acted accordingly. Me, I let circumstances choose me. I never made a hard decision because I always chose the easy way. And look at me now. At least I have doubts," Sterling murmured. "Doubts are the price of having a conscience," Chester replied. "Fools never doubt. The wise doubt and act anyway." He stood up, gathering his bag. "I've got to go. The Talmadge Bridge has better breezes on hot nights. But I'll leave you with this. That treasure you found, those documents that could make you rich again. You know why they're valuable? Not for the money they represent, but because they showed you who you are when nobody's watching. That's a wealth nobody can take from you." He disappeared into the darkness before Sterling could respond. He was alone again, but something had changed. The words of a homeless stranger had penetrated his defenses in a way all the advice from family and friends hadn't managed. He returned to the hospital as dawn painted the sky pink and gold. He found Willa awake beside her grandmother's bed. Miss Althea was sleeping, her breathing labored but steady. "I couldn't sleep," Willa whispered. "I keep thinking about everything I never told her, everything I assumed we'd have time to talk about." Sterling knelt beside her, taking her hand. "Then tell her now. She might hear you." Willa looked at him with tears shining in her eyes. "Do you really think so?" "I don't know. But I know that regretting unspoken words is worse than the risk of seeming foolish by saying them." She nodded and began to speak. She spoke of childhood memories, of lessons learned, of deep gratitude. And as she spoke, Sterling saw something extraordinary. Miss Althea's heart monitors stabilized, her breathing became easier, and for a moment her hand moved, as if wanting to reach for her granddaughter's. In that moment, Sterling understood something fundamental. It wasn't about the big dramatic decisions. It was about these small moments, about being present when it mattered, about having the courage to be vulnerable, about choosing love over fear again and again. Miss Althea didn't die that night nor the next. Against all medical predictions, she began to slowly improve. The doctors spoke of temporary remission and matter of time, but the family chose to see the small miracle it was. "She's stubborn," Mr. Barnaby commented one morning in the workshop, a genuine smile crossing his face for the first time in weeks. "She decided it's not her time yet, and even the good Lord doesn't dare argue with her." With the immediate crisis past, Sterling found himself with mental space to think about the Charleston documents. One afternoon, he spread them on the dining table in the Jones Street apartment. Willa sat across from him, studying them with the attention of a literature scholar accustomed to deciphering old texts. "They're authentic," she murmured, touching the paper with reverence. "These deeds, these certificates. Sterling, this means technically my family owns 3 properties in Savannah's historic district, buildings that now are probably worth millions," he completed. "I know. I've already done some preliminary calculations." They looked at each other across the table, both aware of the weight of what they held. "We could sell one," Willa said slowly, "and use the money to do something meaningful with the other 2. Restore them, convert them into, I don't know, something that benefits the community. A cultural center, workshops for artisans, spaces for emerging artists." Sterling felt something expanding in his chest. What if we could do more than that? What if we combined these buildings with the antiques your family has been keeping? Create not just a space, but a complete experience. Living history, not just preserved in museums, but accessible, relevant. Willa's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Like what you did before, building things, creating vision, but with a different purpose." "Exactly. Not to make money for money's sake, but to create something that lasts longer than us, something that has meaning." They spent that night sketching ideas, words flowing between them like never before. Sterling discovered that years of business experience weren't lost. They just needed to be redirected. Willa brought her knowledge of history, literature, and education. Together, they created something neither could have imagined alone. In the following weeks, as Miss Althea continued her miraculous recovery, Sterling and Willa worked on their vision. They consulted with historians, architects specializing in restoration, community educators. Each conversation refined the idea, made it more concrete. Mr. Barnaby, initially skeptical, became enthusiastic when he saw the plans. "We could have the restoration workshop as the centerpiece. Show people how history is preserved, not just the final result." One September afternoon, when the brutal summer heat finally yielded, Sterling received an unexpected call. It was a journalist from the New York Times who had followed his story from the fall until now. "Mr. Caldwell, I've heard rumors of a new project. Would you like to talk about it?" Sterling hesitated. The last time he'd spoken to the press, it was to announce his ruin. He looked at Willa, who nodded with encouragement. "Yes," he replied, "I would." The interview that followed was different from anything he'd done before. He didn't talk about numbers or acquisitions or market strategies. He talked about history, about community, about creating spaces where people could connect with their past while building their future. He talked about learning to work with his hands, about discovering that value isn't always measured in dollars. "Don't you miss your former life?" the journalist asked. Sterling thought about the sleepless nights calculating profit margins, the lonely meals in expensive restaurants, the constant paranoia of being betrayed. "I miss some aspects," he admitted honestly. "I miss the feeling of making big things happen. But I don't miss who I was in that life. And what I'm building now is bigger, just in a different way." The article that appeared a week later was surprisingly empathetic. "From Millionaire to Craftsman, The Transformation of Sterling Caldwell" was the title. For the first time, the online comments were mostly positive. People resonated with the story of humility, of rediscovery, of finding value beyond the bank balance. But the real turning point came when Miss Althea, now back home though weak, asked them for a family meeting. When everyone was gathered in her small parlor filled with photographs and memories, she spoke with the clarity she'd feared losing. "I've decided to put all our family resources in a trust," she announced, "for the project Sterling and Willa are developing. not as an investment for personal profit, but as a contribution to something that will survive generations. "Mother," Mr. Barnaby began, "It's what's right," she interrupted firmly. "I've spent 90 years keeping secrets, accumulating things, preserving for preservation's sake. It's time all of it has a real purpose." She looked directly at Sterling. "But there are conditions. First, this project must benefit the community, especially families of limited resources. Second, it must preserve our history without converting it into commodity. Third, it must teach new generations that true value isn't in what you possess, but in what you build for others." "I accept," Sterling responded without hesitation. "Good. Then you have my blessing and my resources. Use them wisely." When the meeting ended, and Sterling and Willa walked back to their apartment under Savannah's night sky, she took his hand. "You know what my grandmother told me when we were alone at the hospital?" she asked. "She told me the real miracle wasn't her recovery. It was watching you transform from someone who needed to have everything under control to someone who could let go and trust." Sterling felt tears stinging his eyes. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her the real miracle was finding someone willing to change, because most people prefer to cling to who they are, even when it makes them miserable." They reached their door, and before entering, Sterling embraced her. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For answering that question in Charleston the way you did, for challenging me, for staying when it would have been easier to leave, for believing I could be more than I was." Willa kissed him softly. "I didn't believe you could be more than you were. I saw what was already there, waiting to be discovered." The following months were a whirlwind of activity. Obtaining permits, dealing with bureaucracy, negotiating with contractors, all while continuing to work in the workshop to keep his skills sharp. Sterling discovered that his previous business experience was invaluable, but only when combined with his new understanding of value and purpose. There were obstacles. There always were. A contractor tried to overcharge, counting on them not understanding restoration costs. He was surprised when Sterling, who could now identify different types of wood and construction techniques, pointed out exactly where they were inflating the numbers. A city official tried to delay permits, hoping for a bribe. Willa, who happened to have a former classmate working in the historic preservation department, solved it with a combination of personal connections and passionate persuasion about the project's importance. The first property they restored was a 3-story building on Broughton Street. It had been an inn in the 18th century, then a printing shop in the 19th, and finally had fallen into abandonment. The architects wanted to modernize it completely, but Sterling insisted on preserving original elements: the heart pine beams, the tabby foundations, the wrought iron railings. "Every scratch tells a story," he explained to anyone who would listen. "Erasing them is erasing history." The day they opened the first gallery to the public, with an exhibition on the Gullah Geechee heritage of coastal Georgia, curated by academics from the university, but accessible to everyone, Sterling felt something he'd never experienced in any successful business deal: deep and lasting satisfaction. He saw children from public schools touching old tools under supervision, their eyes bright with discovery. He saw grandparents pointing to objects they remembered from their childhoods, their memories validated and preserved. He saw young artists sketching in notebooks, inspired by the old craftsmanship. "This is what money should do," Willa commented, standing beside him observing the scene. "Not accumulate, but flow. Create experiences, possibilities, connections." But not everything was perfect. One night, Thaddeus appeared unannounced at the workshop. Sterling found him waiting outside when he was closing. "I came to see for myself," Thaddeus said, without hostility but with genuine curiosity. "Everyone's talking about the Caldwell Project. I wanted to see what you built from the dust of your empire." Sterling could have refused to show him. He could have been smug or defensive. Instead, he invited him in and gave him a complete tour, explaining each decision, each compromise between preservation and accessibility, each way they were trying to make history relevant. When they finished, Thaddeus remained silent for a long moment. "You know what's ironic?" he finally said. "I recovered some of our companies. I'm making money again. I should feel successful. But when I come here and see this, I wonder if I chose the wrong path." "There's no wrong path," Sterling replied. "Just different paths. Yours worked for you." "Did it work?" I have money, yes, but I don't have this. He gestured broadly. Purpose, meaning, something that matters beyond my bank account. They said goodbye with a handshake that turned into a brief embrace. When Thaddeus left, Sterling stayed in the workshop a moment longer, processing the conversation. He'd expected the encounter to reopen old wounds, rekindle envy or regret. Instead, he felt only gratitude for the path he'd taken. The second building opened in spring. This one was more ambitious. A craft center where master artisans taught traditional trades to young people from disadvantaged neighborhoods. Blacksmithing, pottery, bookbinding, furniture restoration. Mr. Barnaby directed the woodworking program, and Sterling discovered he loved teaching. Look, he told a teenager who was struggling with a particularly difficult piece. The wood isn't your enemy. It's your collaborator. Listen to what it tells you. The boy, who had come to the program as an alternative to the streets, looked at him skeptically. Wood doesn't talk. Doesn't it look? Sterling ran his hand over the surface. Feel the grain. Every irregularity tells you how the tree grew, what difficulties it faced, where it's strong and where it's weak. If you try to force it against its nature, it'll break. If you work with it, it'll create something beautiful. He saw understanding lighting the boy's face, and he knew the lesson was about more than carpentry. 1 year after that night in Charleston, when everything changed, Sterling and Willa returned to the city, but this time it was different. There was no extreme luxury, no suite at the most expensive hotel. Instead, they rented a small house overlooking the Battery, walking the same streets they'd walked during their honeymoon. Do you regret it? Willa asked one afternoon as they drank sweet tea on a veranda overlooking Charleston Harbor. Sterling considered it honestly. Losing the money? Sometimes. I won't lie and say I don't miss the security, the ability to solve problems with unlimited resources. But the path we took after, not a single day. Not even when you had to learn to sand wood with hands that had never worked, he laughed. Especially then, because it was humbling and difficult, and it forced me to confront who I really was without all the fancy suits and impressive titles. That night at the same hotel where they'd stayed during their honeymoon, they requested the same suite. The manager, remembering them, offered a free upgrade, but they declined. This room has meaning, Sterling explained. This is where everything changed. When they entered, the scent of magnolia greeted them again, carried by the coastal breeze. Sterling looked at Willa, truly seeing her as he did now, not as the idea of a perfect wife, but as the complex and strong woman who had challenged him to be better. Do you remember what I said that night? He asked softly. She smiled. You said, I'm not going to cross the lines. And you responded. What if I wanted you to cross them? She completed. Sterling took her hands. At that moment I thought we were only talking about, well, physical boundaries, but you were talking about so much more, weren't you? Willa nodded slowly. I was challenging you to cross all your boundaries. The ones you'd put around your heart, your vulnerability, your capacity to trust. I knew if you could do that with me physically, eventually you could do it in everything else. You were wiser than me. Not wiser, just less afraid. Because I had nothing to lose except my heart, and I'd already decided to give it to you. They kissed, and in that kiss was a year of transformation, of tests overcome, of difficult choices made with integrity. When they returned to Savannah, they found that Miss Althea had organized a celebration. The entire extended family was there, along with project workers, program students, artisans, friends. The courtyard of the antique shop was decorated with string lights, smelled of home cooking, resonated with the music of a folk guitarist. What are we celebrating? Sterling asked, confused. Miss Althea, now frail but with indomitable spirit, stood with the help of her cane. We're celebrating what should have been your real honeymoon a year ago. We're celebrating not just a marriage, but the union of two souls who helped each other find their best versions. Mr. Barnaby raised his glass. And we're celebrating the success of the project's first year. 300 children have gone through our programs. 50 artisans have found work. Countless people have connected with their history. Sterling felt tears in his eyes as he looked around the courtyard. This was his family now, not connected by blood or business contracts, but by choice, by shared values, by love. But the biggest surprise came when Miss Althea asked him to come closer. I have something for you, she said, pulling an old envelope from her pocket. It's a letter your father wrote before he disappeared. I've had it for years, waiting for the right moment to give it to you. Sterling froze. My father? How? Your family and ours have connections going back generations. When he disappeared, it wasn't because he didn't love you. It was because he was in trouble, trying to protect you from something he couldn't control. He gave me this letter to give you when you were mature enough to understand it. With trembling hands, Sterling opened the envelope. The handwriting was shaky but clear. My son, if you're reading this, it means you grew up without me. There are no words to express my regret. I leave you with one lesson. The money I pursued, the debts I accumulated, the decisions I made thinking I'd give you a better life, all pulled me away from what really mattered. Don't make my mistake. The real treasure isn't in what you accumulate, but in who you choose to be and who you choose to love. With love and eternal regret, your father. Sterling couldn't contain the tears. His whole life he'd built empires to prove he wasn't like his father. And it turns out his father had learned the same lesson he had, just too late. Willa embraced him as he cried, surrounded by family and friends who understood that some tears are of healing, not pain. 5 years after that night in Charleston, Sterling stood in the third building they'd restored. This one was special, an old freedmen's church hidden in the heart of Savannah's historic district, discovered during renovations of a neighboring building. They decided to convert it into a center for intercultural dialogue, a space where different traditions could gather and learn from each other. It was early morning, and he was alone in the space, enjoying the silence before the day began. Rays of sunlight streamed through the restored windows, creating patterns of light on the ancient wooden floor. I knew I'd find you here, a voice said behind him. He turned to see Willa in the entrance, now 5 months pregnant with their first child. There was something in her posture, in the way the light surrounded her, that made him remember that first time he'd seen her in the bookstore cafe, reciting poetry while serving coffee. I was thinking, he said, extending his hand to help her sit on one of the restored pews, about everything that's changed in these years. And I realized that night in Charleston, when I whispered I wouldn't cross the lines, I had no idea what it really meant. I thought I was talking about physical boundaries, about respect, about chivalry. Willa smiled, touching her belly gently. And now what do you think it meant? I think the universe, or fate, or whatever orchestrates these things, was giving me the opportunity to establish who I wanted to be. And you, with your answer, challenged me to be brave in ways I'd never considered. He sat beside her, taking her hand. I crossed the boundaries of my ego, of my need for control, of my fear of being vulnerable, of my belief that money defined value. And every boundary I crossed made me freer, not less. Even now, when we have huge responsibilities, when there are 500 employees depending on us, when we're about to be parents, especially now, because these responsibilities aren't based on fear of losing what I have, but on love for what we're building together. A voice interrupted their moment. It was one of the workers, apologizing for the interruption but needing a decision on a restoration detail. Sterling stood to handle the matter, and as he walked among the old church columns, he marveled at how he'd arrived here. The empire he'd lost now seemed like a different life, lived by a different person. Yes, they'd recovered financial stability, even prosperity, but in a completely different way. The project employed hundreds, educated thousands, preserved priceless history. But more than that, it had created community. That afternoon he received a call from an international journalist. The project had won a European prize for cultural preservation and community development. They wanted to make a documentary about his transformation from fallen tycoon to community leader. What will you say? Willa asked when he told her. I'll tell the truth. That success isn't a straight line. That losing everything can be the greatest gift if it opens your eyes to what really matters. That true love doesn't just accept who you are, but challenges you to be more than you thought possible. That summer, when their son was born, they named him Barnaby Chester, honoring his grandfather and the stranger on the bench who had offered wisdom in a dark moment. When Sterling held his son for the first time, he felt the weight of responsibility to teach him the lessons he'd learned with so much pain. You're not going to grow up thinking money is what matters, he whispered to the sleeping baby. You're going to grow up seeing that what you build for others, the legacy you leave, the relationships you nurture, that's what defines you. Miss Althea, now 95 but still lucid and perceptive, held her great-grandson with tears of joy. "Look what came from that night in Charleston," she said. "A family, a legacy, a future, and all because two people had the courage to cross the boundaries that kept them separated from their best versions." The following years brought more expansion, more projects, more impact, but Sterling never forgot the lessons of the workshop. The humility of working with his hands, the peace of knowing his value didn't depend on his bank account. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, they returned once more to Charleston, to the same suite. Their son, now 5 years old, ran through the cobblestone streets with the same joy Willa had shown years before. That night, when the child finally fell asleep, Sterling and Willa sat on the balcony, listening to the harbor whisper ancient stories. "You know what our son asked me today?" Willa commented. "He asked why we have money but live in a normal apartment instead of a mansion. And what did you tell him?" "I told him that money is a tool, not a purpose, that we use it to build things that matter, not to impress people we don't know. That happiness comes from doing what's right, not from having the most." She paused, looking at him directly. "Did I tell you Thaddeus called me last week? Your former partner, the one who recovered the companies?" "Yes. He wants to sell everything and join our project. He says he finally understood what you tried to tell him years ago, that he spent a decade recovering money only to realize it was empty without purpose." Willa laughed softly. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him we had room for someone willing to learn, to start at the bottom, to work with humility, not as an investor or director, but as an apprentice." "And he accepted?" "He starts next month in the restoration workshop. Mr. E. Barnaby's going to train him." They remained in silence, contemplating the path they'd traveled. From that night when Sterling whispered he wouldn't cross the lines, to this moment of deep peace and lasting satisfaction. "You know what's most ironic?" Sterling finally murmured. "When I met you, I thought the purity I saw in you was fragility, something I needed to protect, but it turned out to be the most powerful strength I'd ever encountered. It protected me from myself, from my worst instincts, from becoming someone who would have been financially successful but emotionally bankrupt." Willa turned in his arms to look at him directly. "And when I met you, I saw a man terrified of showing weakness. But every time you chose to be vulnerable, every time you admitted not knowing, every time you asked for help, you became stronger. True strength isn't never falling. It's getting up each time with more wisdom." They kissed under the Charleston stars, and in that kiss was a decade of transformation, of growth, of love, that had been tested and forged in fire until it became something unbreakable. The next day, as they prepared to return to Savannah, Sterling found a note Willa had left in his suitcase. It said simply, "You crossed all the boundaries that mattered, and on the other side you found all of us waiting for you. With all my love, W." He kept the note in his wallet, next to his father's letter, and a worn photo from their wedding day. 3 treasures worth more than all the millions he'd ever owned. The plane took off from Charleston at sunset, and Sterling looked down at the city that had witnessed the most important turning point of his life. The harbor gleamed golden under the setting sun. The Atlantic stretched like a blanket of blue silk, and somewhere down there was the suite where it all began with a whisper and an answer that had completely disarmed him. Willa slept on his shoulder, their son on his lap, and Sterling felt a gratitude so deep it almost overwhelmed him. He'd lost an empire but gained a family. He'd lost millions but gained meaning. He'd lost control but gained freedom. And if he could go back to that night 10 years ago, when the phone rang with news of financial ruin and the world he knew began to crumble, he wouldn't change anything, because that collapse had been necessary to build something better on the rubble. The boundaries he'd feared crossing turned out not to be barriers but doorways, and on the other side of each door was a more authentic version of himself waiting to emerge. When they landed in Savannah, the evening light painted the church steeples gold and pink. They took a cab to the Jones Street apartment, which they'd kept despite now being able to afford something much larger. It was their anchor, their reminder of where they'd been and what they'd learned. That night, after putting their son to bed, Sterling and Willa sat on the balcony, as they'd done countless times before, listening to the night sounds of Savannah. "Happy?" she asked. "More than I thought possible," he replied honestly. And it was true, because he'd discovered that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or properties or impressive titles. It's measured in moments like this, in the love you share, in the legacy you build, in the lives you touch, in the person you become when nobody's watching. The whisper that changed everything wasn't about physical boundaries. It was about the courage to be vulnerable, to change, to grow. And the answer that completely disarmed him wasn't just words. It was an invitation to become more than he was, to cross all the boundaries that kept him separated from his best version. 10 years later, Sterling had finally crossed every one of those boundaries, and on the other side he'd found not just Willa and her family, but himself. And that, he discovered, was the greatest treasure of all.